When Dorothy stood in the doorway and looked around, she could see nothing but the great gray prairie on every side. Even the grass was not green. Once the house had been painted, but the sun blistered the paint and the rains washed it away, and now the house was as dull and gray as everything else.
When The Wizard of Oz was published in 1900, the book delighted American children. But it has also been read as a political parable of the decade just past, when a grassroots movement of plain, mostly rural people organized to challenge the conditions that seemed to keep them in desperate straits.
Now which way do we go?
Its memorable characters and settings can be seen as symbols drawn from the populist movement of the 1890s. Hapless farmers, dehumanized industrial workers, would-be reformers, marching shoulder to shoulder with a no-nonsense daughter of the heartland to demand from the ruling powers that their needs be met.
If the wizard is a wizard, who will serve?
Their problems came from many sources: the arid disappointment of the Great Plains, the brutal unpredictability of nature, the great forces of finance and industrialization that exploited them, and a government that assumed little responsibility for their protection.
I've got to see the wizard.
Scholars dispute the extent to which L. Frank Baum intended his tale as a parable of populism, but this much seems clear. The 1890s found the common people of America living in a land that was not delivering on its promises. Like Dorothy, they dreamed of a land where their needs and desires would be met. They too would have to give up familiar allegiances and join forces with others to pursue their dreams.
If you please, I am Dorothy.
In the community that my family lived in, most of the African American families still had not been able to purchase land, and that was 30 years after the Civil War. And so they were still living on someone else's property, trying to make a living on someone else's terms. They had to pay for everything. They had to pay for seed. They had to pay for fertilizer. They had to pay for the use of farm animals. Even if you had an excellent crop, even if you had a very good, successful agricultural year, the expenses of life that had to be drawn from that were oftentimes at a great cost.
My grandfather homesteaded the 160 acres, and he farmed it until he finally could not make the payments on the land, and so he sold it and became a sharecropper. You think about feeding 11 and clothing 11. My aunt talked particular about the shoes. They all had a pair of shoes, but you only wore your shoes on special occasions or to church.
Just about ever so often, we would have a hail out. And then, that wasn't good. Maybe we'd have to wear our shoes longer then and have them sold 2 or 3 times before we would get a new one. I'll tell you, money was very scarce.
There is something radically wrong in our industrial system. The railroads have never been so prosperous, and yet agriculture languishes. The banks have never done a better business, and yet agriculture languishes. Towns and cities flourish and boom, and yet agriculture languishes.
American farmers in the late 19th century were experiencing a decline in status, both economic and social.
the agrarian economy, where farmers were the salt of the earth and the mainstay of the republic. The farmers were being passed by, and there was this new working class that didn't quite fit into the old models of republicanism. They saw that capitalism was really coming into its own, that there were these great corporations that hadn't existed 50 years before that no one knew quite how to deal with. What do you do in a democracy that's based on one person and one vote when one person like John Rockefeller might only have one vote, but he has 1,000,000 times as much economic power as other people?
The challenges that farmers had always faced, land, transportation, credit, prices, had been transformed by the industrialized economy into almost insurmountable burdens.
We went to work and plowed and planted. The rains fell, the sun shone, nature smiled. And what came of it? 8-cent corn, 10-cent oats, 2-cent beef, and no price at all for butter and eggs. That's what came of it. Well, then the politicians said that we suffered from overproduction.
The essence of the farmers' problem was that they bought in a market that was protected by high tariffs, so that every manufactured item that they bought cost more than it would have otherwise. And at the same time, they sold in a world market. So they were buying high and selling low.
And this is also a time that sees two major international depressions. So it is going to hit hard, especially in the plains and especially in the South, where commodities such as wheat and cotton and corn are being grown chiefly for the international market.
Decade after decade, farm prices continued to fall. The dollar a bushel wheat of 1870 dropped to 80 cents in 1885 and 60 cents in the 1890s. In Kansas, corn was so cheap by 1889 that it was commonly burned for fuel.
And if, as we sat around such a fire watching the year's crop go up the chimney, the talk sometimes became bitter, who will wonder?
Everywhere he turned, the small farmer encountered systems that worked against him, while benefiting the largest business and financial concerns in the agrarian economy.
Every agent, peddler, and every profession of men is fleecing the farmer. And by the time the world gets their living out of the farmer, as we have to feed the world, we, the farmer, has nothing left but a bare, hard living.
They had a monopoly, the middlemen. If you wanted to get your crop out to market, whether you were a farm owner or a tenant farmer sharecropper or agrarian worker, it impacted you because they were gouging the prices. If the people who controlled the transportation facilities and the storage places could charge what they wanted, then you were squeezed out of the margin of profit that you were hoping to get.
Underlying the commercial structure was the national banking system, dominated by private Eastern banks and rooted in the gold standard.
The insistence that gold was the only real currency meant that there really wasn't enough money in circulation. Farmers were perpetual debtors, and that's why inflation, something that we think of as a very bad word, was a very good word for farmers in the late 19th century. They wanted to inflate the currency to make it more flexible.
While financial pressures affected farmers everywhere, they became unbearable when tied to the crop lien system of the South.
They need to get goods on credit. But since the credit system in the South has become very decentralized, and a lot of these merchants extending credit are really flying by the seat of their pants, by and large, in order to protect their credit operations, they want some security. And so the crop lien is effectively a system by which a farmer or renter would give a merchant a mortgage on the crop, the growing crop, as a way of allowing the merchant to protect the debt.
For millions of Southerners, white and black, the crop lien system was like a new form of slavery. The man with the ledger owned the product of their labor and took their land when the debt grew too high to repay. The records for one Mississippi farmer tell the story. After 15 years of mounting debt, the final entry against his account records the cost of a coffin. As Southerners lost their land, they did what American farmers had always done in trying times. They moved west. The letters GTT became shorthand for their common destination, gone to Texas. There on the rim of the Great Plains, they scratched for survival, supporting a population that had grown by 6 times in a decade. Those were desperate years for farmers in Central Texas, and it was there that the agrarian revolt would find its first foothold. For most of the men and women who gathered in Lampasas, Texas, to found the Farmers Alliance, this was the first thing of much importance they'd ever done.
The farmers began by trying to organize at the economic level. They formed buyers' cooperatives.
They wanted that advantage of combining and selling together rather than having to negotiate on an individual basis in the same way that laborers want labor unions so that they can bargain collectively.
From their base in Texas, organizers implemented a major campaign, sending lecturers across the South and West to build a national organization.
The Farmers Alliance really spreads like wildfire in the 1880s because farmers are fed up with the problems that they're facing.
This was the age before email and faxes and phone and all that. This is before then, so you had to go from one farm to another. I mean, it took days to get stuff around. But they managed to do it because they tapped into something very, very powerful, very vital. The crisis had reached a boiling point.
That I sometimes wish I could split myself up and make a dozen men out of myself and join the alliance that many times. I'd have fists enough to hit extortion, strike monopoly, punch the middle dude who gets what we ought to have, and punch the ignorant farmer for letting him have it.
The alliance's massive effort at agrarian self-help stimulated a formidable opposition.
Well, for obvious reasons, these agricultural co-ops challenge the established market institutions, and those merchants mobilize themselves in a whole variety of ways against this to try to undermine the cooperatives economically, to strike deals, to try to punish people who actually do work with the cooperatives.
The wholesalers are against it, the banks are against it. They can't get credit to run their cooperatives.
In America, as in most democracies, issues that emerge, whether they start out as social issues, economic issues, whatever kinds of issues, they almost always become political. So when the farmers discovered that their economic organizing efforts, their marketing efforts, their cooperative purchasing agreements and all that, didn't get them quite what they wanted, they naturally turned to state governments and then to the federal government.
This creation of a non-political organization is like making a gun that will do everything but shoot.
Farmers Alliance leaders began to feel that in order to really put pressure on the American political system, they would need to organize their own party.
And it emerges out of the idea that both political parties are basically controlled by the big financial and industrial interests in the country, that there's no big difference between them, and only a third-party movement, which is oriented to the needs of producers, could challenge for power at the state and national level.
If the farmers should take it into their heads to act with solidarity in politics, there may be, in the next year or two, some of the liveliest and most surprising politics ever known in these United States.
In St. Louis, in February 1892, an unprecedented alliance came together.
So what happened in St. Louis was a coming together of small farmers, some labor unionists, temperance forces. It was really a convention of reformers and radicals who believed that in order to lead America to a very different kind of future, they would need a very different kind of party. A third party. And Ignatius Donnelly from Minnesota gave a very stirring speech.
We meet in the midst of a nation brought to the verge of moral, political, and material ruin. Our homes are covered with mortgages, labor impoverished, and the land concentrated in the hands of capitalists. We seek to restore the government of the Republic to the hands of the plain people with whom it originated. We ask all men to join with us and help us.
Donnelly articulated a sense that there had been a golden age where every man's vote really made a difference. And where equal opportunity really existed. And this was the populist dream, and the St. Louis Conference began to put that dream into political reality.
We need to raise less corn and more hell.
Less than 5 months after St. Louis, the People's Party had organized sufficiently to hold a national convention. Meeting in Omaha, Nebraska in July of 1892, the first order of business was to formally adopt a platform.
The Omaha platform, the Populist Party platform of 1892, was striking in that it was the most radical statement of principles of any more or less major American political party. It called for the nationalization of the railroads. They recommended the same thing regarding telephones and telegraph. These were emerging institutions, but they thought that the major networks of transportation and communication, because they were so vital, especially to farmers, shouldn't be in the control of private interests, but should be in the control of all the people. The Populists at Omaha also called for a graduated income tax, this at a time when there was no federal income tax.
They were calling for direct election of U.S. senators. They were calling for the sub-treasury loan program, which was basically a farmer subsidization program. And they were also asking for an expansion of currency.
As long as the money supply was constricted by how much gold was in the treasury, that was going to be a problem for the populists. So they wanted to have the currency based on silver as well as on gold, which would force an inflation of the money supply and would make it easier to pay back debts. And also, there were several planks in the Omaha platform which were appeals to urban workers who clearly were not going to like the idea of inflation on the food that they had to buy and the clothing they had to buy, for example. There were demands to support labor union organizing, to lift injunctions on unions. They also supported the 8-hour day.
Populists recognized that to avoid being marginalized as a regional party, they needed to find allies in the Northeast.
It was a difficult reach because their heart wasn't in with the working classes of the cities. They had always thought that the cities were somehow corrupt, they were morally inferior to the heartland. So when the Populists reached out, and as they did in their political platforms, to the industrial working classes, they were doing their best, but they never could quite make it work. They had a little bit greater success, at least initially, reaching out across racial lines.
The Populists basically say to African Americans, look, we're in the same boat. We're suffering because of what's happening to agriculture in the South and elsewhere, and that if we succeed, that everybody is going to benefit, so vote for us.
African Americans in some ways saw an opportunity in the People's Party. They didn't need to have white folks say that they weren't racist. They were less concerned about people's purity, what they thought, what their intentions were, but what they did. And the thing that they were willing to do was go out and build a third party with black people.
By telling the truth, I have converted to our political ideas every colored man and woman in Jasper and Newton counties. I've converted at least 50% of my white auditors.
This was the great nightmare. If you think about Southern politics in the 19th century, a lot of it is built around the ability of big landowners to get the support of small landowners. What happens in the 1890s is that this alliance begins to fracture, and they're very frightened, not only because it's a biracial coalition, but because the kind of demands that they're raising challenge the economic framework and relationships that white landowners and merchants depend upon.
And it didn't take long for the populist opponents in the South to play the race card against the populists, appealing to white farmers on grounds of racial solidarity.
It is the religious duty of Democrats to rob populists and Republicans of their votes whenever and wherever the opportunity presents itself. And any failure to do so will be a violation of true Louisiana Democratic teachings.
The way that they attacked was vicious. And they came after them by literally assassinating leaders, by roughing people up, intimidating them, passing new laws.
In spite of these tactics, in 1892, the Populists elected a number of candidates across the South and Midwest. In 1893, the nation plunged into a major economic depression.
I take my pen in hand to let you know that we are starving to death.
The economic depression of the 1890s was a relatively new phenomenon in the United States. Before countries industrialize, they don't have depressions. So the depression of the 1890s caused everybody to step back and reconsider what the country was getting itself into. This capitalist revolution was new enough that a lot of people still wondered whether it was a good idea, and they felt we're not so far into it that we can't go in a different direction.
In 1894, the People's Party picked up still more seats at the state and national level. In the face of political upheaval, the Democratic Party took a surprising turn at the 1896 National Convention when it nominated William Jennings Bryan for president on a platform supporting the populist call for the free coinage of silver.
Having behind us the producing masses of this nation and the toilers everywhere, we will answer their demand for a gold standard by saying to them, you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold.
And it was a real dilemma for the populists in 1896 because they didn't expect the Democrats to have nominated someone who was as much in agreement with their platform. So they faced this classic dilemma of third parties in American history. Do you support the party and the candidate which supports some of the ideas that you support, or do you hold out for your own independent identity and try to become a major political party of your own? The populists were quite divided about this question.
Populists tended to work with the party that was out of power. So in the Midwest and in the North, that was the Democratic Party. But in the South, that was the Republican Party. The Southerners had been fighting the Democrats in some vicious elections, which probably were stolen from them. And to now fuse with the Democratic Party and support a Democratic candidate was very difficult.
The fusionists finally persuaded the party that Bryan represented their best hope. But the more radical populists perceived that to surrender their identity was political suicide.
Their idea of fusion is that we play Jonah while they play whale.
Meanwhile, the Republican candidate William McKinley, in the expert hands of masterful political strategist Mark Hanna, sat on his front porch in Canton, Ohio, as the big business money rolled in. Hanna paid 18,000 speakers to go out on the stump for McKinley, while Bryan embarked on an exhausting solo effort to speak to the whole country. The entire campaign seemed to boil down to one thing.
Night and day, in every newspaper, in every cafe, and every streetcar, it is the dollar, and the dollar alone, whose fate is discussed.
The Democrats and Bryan embraced free silver, in part because it did address fundamental economic issues. But another reason is that it was a slogan. This two-word phrase that summed up an approach to politics at a time when the Democrats had to come up with something that distinguished them. But another thing that made it appealing was that there was this sort of mystification value of it. And that's always good in a political race. No one can pin you down because no one knows quite what you're talking about.
In form, the struggle is on the currency question. But these are only symbols, and behind them are gathered the world-opposing forces of aristocratic privilege and democratic freedom.
The 1896 election was about the future direction of the American economy. Bryan felt that democracy ought to take precedence over capitalism. McKinley wouldn't have denied that exactly, but his policies were such as to suggest that, in his view, capitalism took precedence over democracy. And the fact is that McKinley won. Now, what do we make of something like this?
Alas and alack, it seems useless to contend against the money power. Every election marks another step downward into the abyss. The people are too shallow and too corrupt to conduct a republic.
I think the legacy of populism is to recognize that there are inequalities in American society, that there are grievances on the part of ordinary Americans against concentrations of wealth and power, and that democracy always faces a problem with great inequalities of wealth.
The populists faced the worst of all possible worlds. They no longer had their really strong independent identity, which they'd had before 1896. And they'd given it up for a failed campaign. So from 1896, the People's Party doesn't fall apart, and they're never again a major factor in American political history.
Despite the fact that the populists faded away, there still was enough support for reform of one sort or another that by the beginning of the 20th century, you could find reformers in both political parties.
So the things that were called for in the late 19th century, whether it was the 8-hour workday or the government regulation of railroads or the sub-treasury loan, would be enacted within a generation.
Bryan really helps to remake the Democratic Party to being what we now think of as the liberal party, a party which believes that the federal government should be used to provide economic opportunity, to help small farmers, to help wage earners. So in some ways, the Democratic Party got popularized, you might say.
Populism is one of those terms that everyone likes to embrace because it signifies an appeal to, an affinity for ordinary people. It's convenient because you're usually not tied down to defining, well, which ordinary people are we talking about? The problem is, of course, that ordinary people have all sorts of different interests. But if you use it in that sense, it's the honest folks of America. And they don't have to delve too closely into the fact that when the term emerged in the 1880s and 1890s, these folks were real radicals.